You know, David, what we have observed over the years, and now over a decade or more, you and I have done the same thing, and you have focused on worldview issues, and so have I, and I've looked at current events, worldview, I've looked at apologetics, as you have. I've looked at eschatology or end-time events. I'm just going to raise some bullet points here, and then I want to get your response, because we've covered topics like I'm going to kind of highlight here, but I don't think a decade or more ago we would have thought that some of the issues that we started talking about back then would explode as they have here in the 21st century, in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century. The church, the increasing apostasy, the increasing falling away, the loss of discernment. We've got the breakdown of the family that we've seen happen over 10 to 15 years. The Arab Spring, the great increase in immorality, the persecution of Christians, the rise of anti-Semitism, and the silence about that in our pulpits and in our pews. The socialistic mentality in America. Whoever would have thought, David, whoever would have thought that almost half of America would be talking about redistributing the wealth, the dysfunction of Washington, the decline of the character of man, some of the shenanigans going on at Super Bowl halftimes. Whoever would have thought we'd be seeing satanic-type demonstrations going on, or even at the Grammys, whoever would have thought that? The rise of radical Islam, again, the ecumenical efforts, lawlessness, praying to false gods, House of Representatives praying to Allah not that many months ago. I could go on and on. America siding now with Cuba, and next it's going to be Iran. The judgment of America, America's betrayal of Israel the last few years. When you started out back in '02, and when I started out a year before that, did you ever think current events, apologetics, etc., would play out this way?
No, and I'm relatively young. I'm 45 years old, and so sometimes I question and think things seem to be moving so quickly in a way that's against God and against His Word. And then I think, well, maybe it's just because I have a limited perspective on the length of time that I'm looking at this. But the things that you mentioned there, and that was a long list, I think what's most noticeable about it now is that things are happening so fast.
Right.
If you take just singularly the issue of same-sex marriage, the fact that that was just being talked about maybe in the early 2000s, but to see how things have changed so quickly, not only in legislation in this country, the way a state, the citizens of a state will vote in favor of having traditional marriage in their constitution, then one judge will come along and deem it unconstitutional or discriminatory and strike it all down, how quickly the states are flipping on this issue. Not because the people so much are changing their minds, although that is taking place in this country, but things are happening so fast now, even with the advances in technology, these phones we carry around, it just things are happening at warp speed. I think that's what really has made a big impression on me over the last 10, 12 years.
I don't know what makes the biggest impression on me. I certainly know that what's going on in the Middle East is very troubling because that affects so many people. It affects innocent Christians. It affects the Jewish people in Israel. The Arab Spring, I watched it in 2011, and I knew what it was going to lead to. It was a no-brainer. But I think the shocking thing was the fact that America was siding on the side of the Muslim Brotherhood instead of a benevolent dictator like Hosni Mubarak, and we could say that about some other benevolent dictators in the Middle East, and suddenly America's on the side of the terrorists. Tell me what kind of feedback you get from your listeners. I just gave that whole list of things that have been so shocking to us as they've morphed in 10 to 15 years. What do your listeners like to hear about and talk about?
Well, I think a lot of the same issues that your listeners like to talk about and hear about, but I think it's almost been like stages. Early in the 2000s, some of these things were coming to the fore, and it's almost like, you're kidding me. I mean, a man marrying a man? I mean, what? That's crazy talk. But then over time, all of a sudden it starts getting pushed through and it happens, and you're just shocked. You just resent the fact that what that's going to do to our country and most importantly to people's lives and their families, and what kind of messages that send to people. And then you get into an area of sometimes you get to feeling hopeless, like everything's going the wrong direction and we don't know this country anymore. What direction is it? And so I think a lot of those different things we felt as a lot of these issues you mentioned, and you mentioned the Middle East too, and I listened to your program and you see what's going on over there. there so quickly. And I think that the greatest shock of all is that we think American leadership should be against what's taking place in the Middle East, and yet in many cases it seems to be supporting the rise of radical Islamists in the Middle East. I know a lot of the dictators weren't exactly warm and fuzzy guys, but when you're dealing in international geopolitics, sometimes you have to side with those who are less evil than what will take their place.
Right.
And the turnover of the Middle East is certainly a geopolitical event that's going to have long-lasting ramifications for our world, and we're seeing it right now, of course, with ISIS and everything else taking place in the Middle East.
And that has been the shocking thing of the last at least year or 2 years, certainly the last year, the rise of ISIS. David Wheaton hosts the Christian Worldview radio program, and that is syndicated, as is Understanding the Times. And you can learn more at his website, thechristianworldview.org, thechristianworldview.org. David, I think the other thing, and we both talk about it on our programs, and I know your audience appreciates when we, because mine does as well, when we look at some of the great falling away in the church. And one of the issues, and it's kind of come to the forefront here in the last couple of weeks, and that is the book about the young man who supposedly died and went to heaven. And then he came out here in the last 2 weeks and said, well, you know what, folks, that really didn't happen. And here's just a real quick clip. It's less than a minute, because here it's ABC News and kind of making fun of us. And that's the tragedy when things like this happen.
Look at this. A best-selling book recounting a 6-year-old's near-death experience is apparently completely fake, according to the boy himself. Alex Malarkey now says he made up the details in the book. It's called The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven. He said he did it because he wanted attention after a horrible car crash that left him a quadriplegic. The publisher says it will pull the book.
So, you know, the trips to heaven, the tours of heaven, it's been a popular genre of books and conversation on Christian television. I don't know what happened. Obviously, in this case, this young man said, you know what, it was all a fraud. But these kinds of things have been exploding in the church for the last 20 years. And what kind of feedback do you get from your audience on this?
Well, we've done programs on this. We did it especially in light of the book, Heaven is for Real. And the conclusion that I draw from Scripture is that if the Apostle Paul saw a heavenly vision and he was told or he chose not to mention anything about it, neither should we. And so, in the fact that there's such an appetite amongst this for these things from Christians and I think non-Christians as well, it is troubling because God gave us everything that we need in His Word to talk about Him, to show us what He's like, what His character and nature is like, what His gospel is. And so there's no need to get reports from 4- and 6-year-olds about what heaven is like. And so I'm a real skeptic. I do believe, of course, in the supernatural, and God can do anything He wants. Too. But these kind of things make me very skeptical. And then after reading the story you just mentioned recently about it all being made up for that one particular book, it just confirms that we can't put our faith in those kinds of things. We don't need to put a lot of emotional investment in those. I think the disappointing thing when we did a program in this last summer was that so many callers called in and just loved the book, Heaven is for Real, and thought it was just so true and so real. And again, I just go back to Scripture. God gave us everything we need to know about heaven in Scripture that He wanted to tell us. Let's just rest in that, know what we read, and not go beyond it. And